benchmarks in place before we start engaging the public in the ask, whatever that is, whether it's a call to action or, you know, them taking a pledge, or in the case of TX2, submitting an image, portraying their participation in a specific way. And I'm echoing. Why am I echoing? Not sure why that's happening. But yeah, so the manner in which I figure out whether or not it's successful is that we set certain benchmarks in place, both in terms of social reach, fundraising goals that we need to hit, in terms of how the audience participates, you know, whether certain triggers are being hit, whether specific audiences that we wanted to reach initially, if they have been targeted and engaged in the manner that we set forth in the very beginning, and usually those are all the things that happen along the way. So if we're setting a thunderclap in motion, if, you know, people are participating in the thunderclap as planned, if the corporate entities we're engaging with, for instance, with TX2, there's also the aspect of WWF collaborating with Whiskas to raise money through the corporate outlet, and they managed to hit the fundraising goal during the time that the TX2 campaign was running. So they've been raising money over some time, but then getting that final push from the TX2 campaign helped get that the sort of public involvement they were looking for the corporate input, because it was matching dollars to public participation. And we hit the £1 million mark, like, I think a week into TX2, which was great. So yeah, it's all of those things. So like even now I've just been working through a campaign that I'm going to start in the Congo, and that's, you know, it's sort of like right now it's all confidential, but like once again it starts with the basics as to like what are all the different partners that are engaging in this conversation looking for. What do they want? Do they want to reach the local markets in terms of the Congolese, or are we trying to raise awareness in international markets? If we raise awareness in international markets, how is that actually going to help Congo? Do we need both the regional effort, the grassroots upwelling, as well as sort of the trickle down from the international? If that's the case, and then, you know, so it's like we have to look at all the parameters and then we start going into it. But usually it comes down to also fundraising. Like, you know, each organization has specific outputs they want from it. So yeah, it depends from NGO to NGO. I'm going to mute myself or like wait for the next question.
Yeah, so does anyone else send your questions to Asher? So again, she's the one who did the thumbs up campaign, which was awesome. So I guess, Asher, so what made you compelled to be a part of WWF's T2 campaign?
WWF approach. Okay, so well, I mean, how do I decide which campaigns to be a part of and which I can't like help or engage with? For the most part, I say yes to almost every issue and every nonprofit that I can potentially work with that pertains to either biodiversity loss or the denudation of ecosystems that are critical habitats. You know, whether in Congo, for instance, it's going to be, you know, pristine rainforests that are sort of the last bastion to carbon sequestration in its natural form without us having to intervene and do reforestation or forestation efforts and other things. So before it becomes like the next Amazon, we're trying to intervene in these specific areas. And yeah, I think like it just comes down to if I can help, if I do have a clear understanding of the ask, if the ask is not counterintuitive to my understanding of what is the right thing to do. So it has to be congruous to my ethical standards and to my internal sort of like my integrity. That's the best way I would put it, is if it feels like it's out of line with my integrity, then I would not take it on. But for the most part, if I can help, I help. So I don't do just a specific animal or a specific region of the world. I try to take on as much as I can, because I also think it deepens my understanding of the bigger picture, because you look at the macro trends when you're working on specific areas, because it's sort of a microcosm that gives you a greater depth of understanding of what's happening also as on the larger trends. Because our apathy, our consumer demands, the way in which, like even yesterday when we were talking, we were looking at, you know, the 4.8 Earths out of US in terms of resource footprint. we consume so much that there's a reason why Congo is enduring the devastation and the bushmeat crisis and all of those things. It's because of external pressures and what we're taking from that land. So the extractive industries don't manifest in these areas if it weren't for the United States or Australia or all these other countries that are putting the pressures on these places because of our daily demands, whether it's from mobile phones and the mining that you have to do for rare earths for those phones, or looking at palm oil plantations, or whatever the problem is. It happens because we're asking for those resources in developed nations. So yeah, it just ultimately comes down to if I feel like I can help and there's a clear vision, then I usually get behind it. How did I first get involved in conservation? So when I was really young, I was very into wild, and I used to rescue anything and bring everything home. Very influenced by Gerald Darrell and Dr. Dolittle and David Attenborough, and just was obsessed with wildlife. And I think like I used to volunteer a lot. So I always knew I wanted to do something to help. It took me a while to figure out how, because I was very emotionally invested in what I saw in the world around me. So when I saw devastation, I didn't internalize that well, and I didn't process it to the point where I was able to channel that anguish into something positive. And so invariably I would just come apart and I wouldn't know what to do next. And it was only after I went to Parsons and I had a fashion design background and a design way of looking at problem sets. So like, the whole premise of design is that you know that every problem set, if it's articulated in the right manner, the solution exists within that problem phrasing. So I would just look at problems in a new way. I would look at, where's the solution within that problem set, and looking at how form and function can come together, how art can have application and incite action. All of that came about, that sort of thinking came about through a design education. And then when the BP oil spill happened, I just couldn't sit back anymore. I was again emotionally reacting to what was going on in the world around me. I had assumed, which was very naive thinking on my part, but when I was in grade school, I just thought, by the time I grew up or like went through uni and all of that people would have taken care of those big issues and it wouldn't be a part of my reality anymore. That we would have learned from Exxon Valdez, and like that sort of spill wouldn't happen again, because obviously it's happened once, so we should know from our mistakes to do better. But clearly we're stupid and incredibly unlearning, and like history repeats itself almost every year. So we don't even have to wait for a decade for something awful to happen. So time's just compressing, and like the greed is just exponential, and the resources are finite, and people are even on a highly informed, like I just had a really long conversation with this guy from the space program, the European Space Mission, and he is a double PhD with life sciences backing, and his views are so poorly informed, and serious resources are being allocated because of his opinions. And I'm just amazed that it's like he's so life apathetic that I'm just like, I don't understand how people who are educated can be that ignorant. And that's one part of the issue. And these are people who are like looking at where funding needs to go, and they're more interested in bionic plants and like how we can print food than looking at what we can do to conserve the resources we have on hand. And it's the same thing with the Long Now Foundation, investing considerable resources into, recreating things that we've destroyed, and into genetic research, into de-extinction, which I think is the most like far removed understanding to have from what is needed in this day and age, is to protect what we have left and to do one better, instead of bringing back things that have no context anymore in the most cruel way possible, which is to like have something else give birth to something because that the parent, doesn't even exist for this offspring that needs to come into place. It's just absurd. It's absurd what we do. And we somehow think that this is the right way forward for conservation. And I think that's appalling. So I think even though people are educated and informed through book standards, through academic standards, it's still not enough to sensitize them emotionally, through compassion, through understanding of intrinsic value for biodiversity and ecosystem. So I think that's where like creative mediums come into play. That's when something larger than just scientific understanding, because that's not enough, clearly. Like, people can misinterpret data or like look at data a certain way, and it's from a space where it's not emotional, it's money, or it's just the idea of, you know, self-congratulatory human hubris. It's just us being egotistical, thinking that we can do one better than nature. And I literally had that astronaut tell me that. He was like, you know, nature is flawed design and we can do better than that. And I was like, wow, you really think that we can do something better than 4.6 billion years of evolution can. So that's great. Like, well done. But, you know, that's people out there thinking that. So I just think it's kind of appalling to discredit sort of the complexity with which life has evolved on Earth. And a lot of people do think that. So for me, it's like it's never a dull day, and there's always new ways in which conservation can be evolved and the dialogue can be moved forward with some level of empathy cultivated in those who are in the know but are like ill-informed. So here's another question: what keeps you hopeful for biodiversity with all the negative things happening in the world? I have my dark moments when I spiral out, and it definitely weighs on me when things feel like there's no progress being made, and for every small thing you do in one place, the policy makers or the legislative measures happening there or the sudden upturning of the government can result in all the positive measures being put in place being completely disregarded, and, you know, they spiral out even further. And sometimes even the things where yesterday a large focus of the workshop we were conducting was about examining how, you know, sometimes when people put solutions in place, it actually has ill effects. For instance, they very recently tried to equip people in West Africa with local ways of monetizing and creating an economic model that would allow them to grow crops and find alternate sources of revenue. But that revenue was then utilized to buy more arms so they could go poach more elephants. So we essentially, as nonprofits, funded poaching, which to me is just so ill-informed. But it's, you know, these kind of mistakes happen where, like, we don't listen to the community, we don't look at what the community's dynamic is, what they want out of it, and why they are poaching to begin with. And so we think we're helping them by giving them alternate means of subsistence, but really they just utilize that to further do what they've already been doing, because it's a quick buck, and they're doing it for other reasons beyond just quick or sustainable economic solution. So a lot of it is that we're not listening to the people that are on the ground. A lot of it is that we're just spoon-feeding solutions as we see fit, and then we just, you know, leave, and then we don't see what has taken root and whether it's going to substantiate itself in the long haul, because people have internalized it as something that they care to do. So yeah, I mean, you see all forms of things spiraling out, but I think the hope I derive is that if you see the sheer number of people involved, and I talk to a lot of people who have been in the movement for a long period of time, and I do ask them point blank, I'm like, are you optimistic? Like, you've been doing this, because I know people who've been in this movement who have seen the first rise of like the ivory trade, and then the moratorium being passed, and, you know, the sort of the lull period, and then the poaching crisis kicking up again. So people who lived through it twice and have seen the devastation twice, they're still hopeful. So I'm like, you know what? Okay, so like this, there, and plus there's so much good in humanity. I think like people do extraordinary things. Even for me, like I've seen people stand by me at times when it's been really hard. But in terms of like if I've had a lack of resources to do something, or trying to mobilize a large faction towards an end goal, like people come through. And so I think there is much hope, because we're complex, diverse, weird creatures, and there's a lot of good in us, but there's also a lot of bad in us. And so I guess I hang on to the good. Another question: how do you convince people, especially the educated ones you mentioned, to start supporting what needs to happen now? I try to come back to them in their language. Like with this particular guy who I spoke to, he recommended a book to me. So I'm reading the book because that's his Bible and he subscribes to it. And I want to better understand his position, even though every cell in my body is like just boiling and recoiling from everything that he said. I understand that it's a counter perspective, and I can't come at it from a reactionary space. So I always try to inform myself as to why a person thinks the way they think. And I try to come back to them in the same vernacular, because if they speak in a certain vocabulary and that's what they're used to, you need to come back to them with that same logic, but twist those words around in a way where you're delivering your perspective such that they can assimilate it, such that they're receptive. Also, like straight out telling them, even though they've said all that they've said and they've been actually condescending toward your perspective, that you still think they're wrong. And I called them out on it at the end of my conversation with them. I was like, I still think you're rubbish, but like, I'm going to read your book and I'll come back to you with a proper argument, because I'm not going to just like, retaliate for the sake of retaliating from an emotional space, because that never wins anybody over. So I try to cast my emotions aside before I respond. And that's how you get through to them, is to also give people a chance that, the opportunity to express themselves and give them validity. Like, yes, you have the right to think the way you think, but then here's where those things are not following through on logic, and here's where these things can help improve your perspective. So it's like allowing them to express itself gives them the opportunity to be more understanding, but perhaps they should listen to you because you're listening to them. So just be patient, I suppose. What are the trends you see in future conservation? Well, a lot of it now with the IUCN Congress that just happened in Hawaii and Honolulu, the majority of the conversation seems to be steering in the direction, which is very unfortunate, but in sort of a very utilitarian model where you're looking at how you can do trade-offs and offsets, and like looking at biodiversity trade-offs, which is to say that, we're going to forgo this population of tigers because that's where infrastructure growth is going to happen. So they're buggered, but we're going to allow for this area to be protected, and the corporate entity that's going to develop the roads over here will ensure that they're doing good by investing into the conservation of this area of tigers, which I think is absolutely rubbish, because it doesn't portray any understanding of intrinsic value. It doesn't mean that we're going to change business as usual. It means that we're not going to forgo our paradigm that we're currently on. So I think the very formula, the foundation that we're standing on, has to change. The way people are birthing, the birth rates need to change. The way people are looking at contraceptive use and contraceptive campaigns. Talking to women in developing nations and telling them not to procreate is the hardest thing. It's the most politically incorrect thing you can go and do, to talk about women's rights and then tell women that, hey, you can't use your uterus to do the one thing it's meant to do. And also culturally, fertility is so rooted in a woman's identity that to take that away from a woman is to basically take away her essence, to take away what she stands for in that culture. So to go into those places where they have 6 kids, 9 kids, because that's what they can do, and to empower them to not do that by giving them access to education, access to alternative career paths and things like that, that's a pretty tricky business. But I think women's empowerment is integral to like conservation. If women aren't empowered in the community, we cannot protect the biodiversity or the ecosystem there. And also, if they don't run the money becomes very myopic, because women are the people who actually think the long haul, because they think for the next generation, because they can give birth. So that if you talk to them about their children's future, they understand that these resources need to be made available for the next generation. Men do not get this, which is why the bushmeat trade, the primary way in which we've been able to dissuade that even in Tanzania, was to go and create microeconomies where women ran the economy. So to give them the cash, to give them the capacity to handle the budget for the community, the women met on a weekly basis to decide how they would invest, where they would invest, and the men were deterred from going into the field for long periods of time to lay out wire snares and catch whatever they could, because then once they got that animal and sold it to market, they would just drink themselves stupid and go and kill again, because that's how they would get quick buck to drink again. But when women are empowered, then the men have to stay home. They have to be around to run the business, to take care of things, to like have a more family perspective, family-oriented perspective. So I think women's empowerment is integral to it. And I think if you guys look up, like, I don't know if you've done, if you looked up the book Corporation 2020 by Pavan Sukhdev, he's an economist that I know in Lyon. He used to be the senior advisor for Deutsche Bank, and he gave a TED talk called The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, TEEB. He's also one of the founders of the Red Plus Plus movement that has had like also, sort of negative impacts, because it's been kind of bullshit sometimes, but it was done with the right intention, and I think he has a good understanding and mindset behind how you value wild. So I quite appreciate his perspective, and I think like you could look up some of his stuff. Here, I can type out his name. It's a bit weird.
Yeah, anybody else, please feel free to ask Asher questions while we have her on the call. Me and Brooke have thrown out some stuff, so now it's your turn.
Crickets.
Wait, oh, sorry. I'm
sure,
just
go ahead.
So I did similar work with the wildlife trade for my master's thesis, and I was just curious, and the theme is campaign planning, and you take that, how do you take that passion and fury and translate into something that people can understand? How have you been able to bridge that gap between science and understanding?
And the way I do that is by looking at what, I mean, this is also like, it's sort of an intuitive process. So like to assign complete logic to it would kind of betray the integrity of the process itself. But as a creative, I constantly look at patterns, and like, I'm always taking in stimulus. So right now I'm working, for instance, on climate resilience, and you know, I'm looking at what is the market you're trying to reach? What visual cues can they recognize in their daily vocabulary? Like, what do they see around them that is familiar to them, that is second nature to them, that they don't have to work out? And then what is the content I need to get to them that they do need to work out? So it's about bridging that hiatus between what is known and what is unknown, and to make it more palpable, right? So you're trying to just find ways in which you can place that product, whatever it is, whether it's the solution set, whether it is the way in which you perceive biodiversity, the way in which a particular species has value, becomes an asset or an icon to that country. You have to basically position it like the way you would a product in a marketplace, you know? So there's like a diversity of messages out there. Why should this particular message be any more valuable or interesting, or something that would captivate an audience? And I think that's how I think of it. It's partly from a marketing branding perspective, but partly also just looking for visual cues constantly as an artist. So like, for instance, with the Pandas of Africa campaign that I did, one of the primary asks was, you know, China is so great at protecting pandas, but they don't give a shit about African wildlife. How can we get them to care? So with creating the Pandas of Africa, like it went viral in China, especially in the below 40 category, where like with Weibo and all the other social media conduits in China, people adopted it as an extension of their voice, partly because of the illustrative style, which was sort of anime, but also because they thought it was cute, and then they did understand the integral message, which is that you've done something well in China, can you take that positive attitude towards African wildlife as well? So inherently reframing the entire dynamic such that you bring them into the solution set, as opposed to pointing fingers and blaming them for the way things are. Because then the minute you see the sort of antithesis and like creating this us versus them paradigm, like you've done this badly, we're doing this well, like, I mean, come on, like I live in the United States where like we've destroyed everything. We don't even have primates in the United States, which just occurred to me. I'm like, Western Europe, like all the developed world has no primates. That's really scary. You know, we've just like done away with all kinds of life forms. And I take that for granted. When I wake up, I just assume that of course there's going to be no like monkeys outside my window. But that's not what's happening in many countries where we're losing that wild, right? And so they can see that process unfolding. And we can talk to them, but we also have to be understanding of the fact that we've done away with a lot, and we're going on fine without it anyway. So the progress has happened, and the developing nations are seeing the progress, but they're not seeing the cost, and they don't understand if the cost even means anything. Because like I often iterate with any of the work that I do, any of the campaigns I create, you know, we have to show the world, we have to show people what it means to live with something in order to know what it means to live without it. So if you don't show that shift in the baseline, there is no understanding of the loss. So we don't know what it even, like most people don't know what it means to live with gorillas. Like, so whether you have 800 gorillas left in the world or 8 gorillas left in the world, what do I care? So that is the disconnect you're bridging. So you have to bring it from a much more personal space. So whether, you know, I've said this in a Nat Geo talk, whether you're putting the statistic within the understanding of an everyday routine. For instance, I talk about the fact that we're losing an elephant every 15 minutes, and you know that when I go on a date, I'm thinking about this particular number that we're losing an elephant every 15 minutes. So by the time I get to dessert, I'm wondering if the guy I'm sitting across is worth the 6 elephants that have been lost in the time that we've been eating, you know? And I'm like, and often he's not. And that has some comic relief, but it also tells people that an elephant is being lost every 15 minutes and you're out there eating food, drinking, brushing your teeth, doing whatever you're doing. So just to have some understanding of what the numbers are, what we stand to lose within the context of your everyday life, because it is a part of your everyday reality, but people disengage from that responsibility, right? But it is your responsibility. The world is the way it is because of us. So each and every one of us are responsible for the global commons, except no one will, it's like no one will take like the burden on. And if we don't each do it, if we don't each do the part, then we stand to lose all of it. And then no one's going to be the one to say, you know, I was the one who shot the last elephant down, because we've all done it over time with our apathy, as well as like those who are in the ground, I mean, on the ground in the field, who are gunning these animals down. So I think it's the collective responsibility that's really hard. It's the tragedy of the commons. Do you think
anyone else for a question?
To make a significant change in declining numbers of wild animals? I think the average person, I think the first part is just being more informed. Like, I think knowing makes a huge difference, because I've seen people who are like even in the 1%, right? Like who are incredibly wealthy, who can be donors, who can participate by just giving funds towards various programs, whether it's advancing scientific research on the ground or helping a campaign take off, or, you know, to actually combat, you know, by funding anti-poaching patrol teams and things like that. These people weren't in the know, and literally in the last 2 years, I've seen a woman who went from not knowing anything and just taking safari vacations with her husband to being utterly engaged and now creating a foundation and funding various programs on the ground. And I think it really is about educating people, but understanding what they're passionate about, what they care about, and it has to come from an authentic space. So if a person doesn't genuinely care, then they won't really be behind the effort. You know, they won't put their money where their mouth is. And I think it's also, you know, the average person, like we have to be discerning. I think as conservationists, we have to know what we want from each of the people that we hit, the demographics that we hit. Because when Coca-Cola puts an advertisement out, it knows what it's looking for in terms of returns, right? In terms of sales, in terms of the turnaround, like the turnover as well. So when we put a campaign out, when we put an ask out, we can't engage a student in the same capacity that we could engage Bill Gates, the same capacity that we could engage Colgate or like Coca-Cola to get on board. So there's a different ask with each of these partners that we can bring on board to enable an end goal. And we also have to know when we're selling ourselves short, because, you know, working, like, yes, of course, the pet food industry is heinous and has its own ramifications on the wild, because we're taking forage fish and, like, you know, sieving it out of the oceans. We're taking apex predators sometimes and feeding them to our cats, which is ridiculous. So like to be feeding salmon and tuna to our cats is one of the main reasons why tuna is on the brink of extinction. But if I didn't partner with Whiskers, we wouldn't have raised 1 million pounds for tigers. So it's always a constant trade-off. Like, do we want to take money from the devil and put it towards something that's good? Because they exist anyway, while trying to educate them about better engaging even on the pet food front. I say take that chance, you know, try and educate them, because it's like turning a blind eye to that and excluding them from the dialogue is not really a solution either, because they're going to continue to exist and people are going to continue buying that product irrespective. So I think, you know, if I can engage and enrich and enhance the way in which brands are partnering up and doing things with the environment, then I try to do that. There's no point saying that this is just bad and I'm never going to work with that, because it exists. It's part of your reality. It's part of the problem. And you turning a blind eye, it's just allowing it to exist anyway. So, so I think it's like multiple factors, you know, it's like how you engage, who you're engaging, what the ask is the ask congruous to the demographic that you're taking that from, and then trying to get the right people behind the most impact. So I know for a fact that, like, if I'm running a campaign, I want public engagement, because that's where the awareness lies, where people are talking about it, at least know about it. Like, for instance, working with, like, when we did a poll, just now we ran surveys, 100% of the US demographic, like just cross-section of society, knows about gorillas, right? Everyone knows about gorillas. And mostly that might even have to do with King Kong, the movie coming out, whatever. But they know about gorillas. They know they're endangered. They know that they need to do something to protect them, that there's very few of them left. But they don't particularly know any other specifics. But talk about a species like bonobos. Less than 15% of the college-educated mass knows about, and this is not even like the uneducated or the people who don't have access to information. 15% of college-educated people know about bonobos. So that's a pretty screwed species as far as we're concerned, because like no one even knows about them. They're not on anyone's radar. There's no research on them. It's like less than 8 articles have come out from US zoos on bonobos. So that's a huge like disconnect in what information exists, what is actually even being done. There's no scientific research to like to uncover the mystery behind the bonobo. So no one's actually allocating resources to protect them. So right now I'm like working exclusively on bonobos because they're just the most disregarded species and no one knows about them. And they're the most like humans. And they're the only species that is not excessively violent to the point of killing one another. They don't ever kill one another. That's never been observed. So I'm like, you know, they're sort of a make love, not war kind of species that I do want to put out there, because I think they bring out the best in us. And since we haven't figured out how to stop killing each other, maybe we can learn something from this amazing ape. But I think, you know, that's how I pick my causes, because they pick me, because they literally have people knocking down my door being like, you need to meet this ape. And that's where the love affair starts. And I'm like, okay, how can I help this cute little thing that's just like dying in some corner of the world that no one knows about? And then I get sucked into the whole vortex, you know, so then all my resources and time and everything goes into having to travel to that part of the world, be part of that story, figure out ways to get more partners involved, get more people in the know, like on the ground, to even get the campaign off in the way it should, and then to also educate the organizations I'm working with so they know better as to how to equip themselves in terms of social engagement, outreach. So it's like it's an obsession. It's like a 24-hour thing. So when I'm in a meeting for one issue, I'm still having things playing in the back of my mind for another issue. And like I'm resolving and sending pitch decks as I'm working on one thing. So it's like, it's just constantly haunting me, and it's what I do 24/7. It's like when I'm sleeping, I still have ideas. I sleep with a notebook beside my bed because I wake up in the middle of the night and sketch, you know, because I have like some sort of insight and I'm like, okay, that could be a good campaign. So it just has to come from like a larger space that you feel like you can make a difference. And so if you target the right demographic and have the right us, I think you do drive impact, and you can address the declining numbers in the wild, because otherwise we wouldn't even have clung on to what we have right now. We would have lost so much more. I think we have what we have because there are people like us asking these questions and doing the kind of groundwork that needs to get done. So.
Awesome. Oh, another question.
Yeah, how do you effectively use social media to spread awareness and support for your campaigns? Like, I think it's partly knowing when to, like, and it's trial and error. I've been learning every step of the way. Every campaign has successes and failures. So I know what wasn't done right, and then I try to take that as a lesson learned to the next campaign. And I think it's just knowing, most of the time, I feel like nonprofits think raising awareness is a very abstract, noble thing they're doing. They just do it without any kind of specifics in mind. And I'm just like, wow, who do you want to reach? And they're like, everybody. And I'm like, that's very kumbaya, but that doesn't help, you know, your cause. Like, you don't understand what you're trying to do then. I need to sit you down and start with basics. Like today, I literally sat down and worked out the fact that these people, I'm like, do you want to know why bonobos are not known? Because it doesn't even have a Twitter feed. I'm like, you guys have absolutely no social presence. Like, what the hell have you been doing? So I had to sit down with them and talk to them about how to come up with blogs, how to come up with Twitters, like Twitter account feeds, like for each of their projects and initiatives. Like, there's so many nonprofits, but none of them have a Twitter presence. So I was like, you need an account. Here's how. And this is the kind of hashtags you should be using. Like, just completely oblivious, because they come from a different generation, and they're scientists who are working on the ground who don't have a deeper understanding of how social media even works. They're an older generation. Like, it's a mix of factors. And like, literally, she opened the door. She's like, I need to breathe. Like, I can't take all of this information in. And it was really hysterical to see someone just like struggle with taking all of the data in, like what they need to be doing for social engagement. So I think social media has a tremendous capacity to reach a large audience, because even with the Tigers campaign, we hit over 260 million accounts. So if you're very strategic about who your partners are, when you deploy them, and at what point they are each engaging their specific audiences, you can reach the numbers you want to reach. So it really is about like calculating ahead of time, this is the number we want to hit, and then going for it, you know, like knowing how to make that happen. And then the other aspect of it is also, like, for me, when I say trial and error, like my whole career has happened because of Facebook. Like, I literally put up 2 campaigns, which is the ones that I ran in China and in with Wild Aid in Hong Kong. was through the blood ivory, you know, the silhouette of the elephant in black with the blood tusk, and the same thing with the rhino with the blood horn. So that composite image, I put those two up in a very initial iteration on Facebook, and I just put it up because I was like, I didn't even know how to help. At that point, I didn't even know the difference between an Asiatic elephant and an African elephant, which to me right now, I would like literally like punch myself out. But like highly embarrassing to be in the conservation space and not know that they were completely different aesthetics. Like I just assumed an elephant looked like an elephant. So dumb. But anyhow, at that point, I put an Asiatic elephant for the poaching trade, which is just so wrong. I can't even tell you, because like that's not even one of their primary threats. Like Asiatic elephants are targeted because of human-animal conflict, because of agricultural development, and like misuse of land management and all those things. It's not particularly poaching because most of them don't even have tusks on them. Anyhow, so at that point, I put those two campaigns up on Facebook, and I remember having such a huge response. Like I just put it up and didn't even have a clue. And 3 months later, I was tagged in all these like comment streams on Facebook where people were like, "Oh, this was created by Asher J." And I remember it being looped back to me. And then finally, I started getting calls from Africa where they were like, "I'm sitting here in Uganda, and this kid has a Facebook cover photo with this image on it. Did you create that?" And I was like, "Holy crap! Like I can't believe someone is calling me from Uganda." Like I wouldn't even have thought. That's the reach of Facebook, you know, and it's like incredible what it did overnight. Like I had all these organizations across Africa aware of my work, what I was capable of doing and how I could help. And then I could actually engage with these on the ground entities to empower them to have a voice on an international and regional scale, which was very unanticipated at that point. And I think I've built on that ever since. Like now I know what Facebook can do, what Instagram and Twitter and all these accounts can do. And also how to like, and I think over time also the platforms have developed in very interesting ways. You can collate information, you can assess through analytics, like, you know, what sort of reach you're having, what demographics you're hitting, and how you can further enhance that. So I think like you get a better understanding of who you're getting through to, and how can you enhance that reach, you know, to that particular demographic. Then can I expand that to other markets? Can I replicate that? But oftentimes also copy paste does not work, because culturally, the red I could use, a Christmas red that I could use in the United States to get a happy message across about protecting wild, the same red could mean like, you know, bloodshed in someplace else, and it could mean like prosperity in China. So it's just knowing what market you're hitting, what message you're getting across, and what colors you're using, what messaging is really translating versus what you think you're putting out there. So oftentimes I get a lot of feedback from local agents that are working on the ground who know the market better than I do. And they very specifically tell me that you can't use X, Y, and Z. You can't say the following words here because it will not translate. For instance, I was doing bushmeat crisis in Kenya, and there's no Swahili word for wildlife, right? So like when I go in there and I talk about, you know, bushmeat is bad, their wildlife, their word for wildlife is wild meat, wild flesh. So they just have two different ways of looking at meat market. They understand domestic flesh and wild flesh. They eat both. So they don't understand when you say you can do one but you can't do the other. They're like, but that's flesh too. It's just meat on feet. It's running. I can consume that. So it just took a while. It was lost in translation, but I began to understand, like, you know, when you're running campaigns, it has to target them differently to get them in on the know so they can change their consumer habits. And why should they? Why is wildlife different? Why is it important for the long haul value economically as well as ecologically to that landscape? So yeah, so that's part of it. And then how does public engagement, education, and awareness translate into effective policy or legislative action? Right, like it depends on which groups you work with, but like when I've done campaigns and then connected back to entities like Elephants DC that is entirely focused on policy and legislative measures, I think it entirely can result in signature campaigns or people petitioning for, asking for a specific action to take place, and that has resulted in bills going through. I wouldn't overlook sort of public opinion on certain matters, because even when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wanted to do something with the crushed ivory, I lobbied against them, which had pros and cons because a lot of people were against me for doing that. But to lobby against that understanding to use ivory in any capacity at all, to assign it any value aesthetically, whether it's educational or not, I'm like, what prevents China from saying that's educational use of ivory as well? You know, like we're just creating another loophole for them to exploit. So I started an online petition, went against them. I got like about 4,000 signatures or something, I don't know, 3,000 something odd signatures. But it was enough to go back to Fish and Wildlife and be like, look, I have enough support from people who are in the know, who are saying this is not a viable course of action. And I finally got them to listen, and like we're moving in a direction where they're at least including me in the conversation as opposed to shutting me out of the door. So I think it's just a matter of finding, the ways in which you can affect change within the system, and to actually sit in on those conversations, to be a part of the delegations and the sort of entities, the senatorial staff that are capable of passing those drafts, those legislative bills, and to have them send it to you first so you can read through it and send them feedback on what loopholes you assess, just because you have a deeper understanding or a more creative take on things, which they've done. Like, they've included me in those conversations. So I think it's just a matter of putting yourself out there and asking to be a part of that dialogue too.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Asher. I think I learned a lot about just campaigns in general, which will really help we're about to do a brainstorming exercise to brainstorm a campaign for Wild Tiger. So we'll see if it actually goes or not. But it's always good. I think, I read a quote saying, you're not going to know how to go somewhere if you don't know your destination. The idea of the quote. And I think you nailed that on the head with knowing your audience, knowing what you want, and then that's how you map your success to it. So.
And the other thing I would also say is there's a lot of clutter. Even when any of the nonprofits approach me, they want to get everything out at the same time, because obviously everything needs to get done. But if you can't prioritize in your ask, you're going to lose the public. And because any engagement that they do, even if it's something as simple as tweeting something out, they feel like they've participated, therefore they've helped and they're done. So you have to be very specific in how you're galvanizing the audience, because once they've taken an action, whatever it is, it could be something really frivolous. And if you only ask for a frivolous action, they won't come back later to do something more intended that is going to have more impact, because they feel like they've already contributed by doing the frivolous action. So you have to be very careful what the ask is, and that you only do one ask at a time, because they have the attention span of sets of flies. Clearly, this whole generation is just like, they're gone. So if you're not succinct and you're not very effective in your ask, they're gone. So yeah, it's hard to keep them squatted in a room, like focused on one particular end goal.
I hope everyone realized that she just called us tsetse flies, but I'm not offended.
No, I mean that of the entire generation. Like, we all have sort of an ADD from being overstimulated and constantly inundated with content and information. Like, we're all just so, scattered that and there's so much going on. There's so many asks of us on any given day. If you just go online, if you go wake up and put the TV on, there's so many ad spots. There's so much. Like, earlier, it used to be every 8 minutes there would be maybe 2 stories. And this is in the 70s. There used to be 2 stories for every 8 minutes of television. Right now, for every 8 seconds, there's 2 stories. That is the amount of content being channeled at us. So it's no wonder we're this distracted and this overwhelmed. So there's a reason why we're in this level of high stress and constantly frenetic pace of doing. It's because we're just inundated. So we should be realistic about what kind of content we're putting out and what sort of competitor environment we're putting it out into.
Yeah.
Because your story is just one amongst many others, right?
Yeah. I agree. There's so much. It's information overload. So it is hard to know what's even real and what's possible and everything. So, well, everyone, wave a goodbye, and thanks for joining us, Asher, again.
My pleasure.
We really appreciated it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.